to begin this work. So in a spirit of compromise and understanding, establishing a commission is not currently acceptable to some. I've worked with my colleagues to include an independent assessment of our overseas basing in this legislation. Now, Mr. President, I'd like to speak now as if in morning business for 5 minutes.
Without objection.
What I'd like to speak now is regarding the payroll tax votes that we're going to be taking later today or possibly even this evening. I want to tell you exactly why I'm going to vote against both these proposals. I believe they're gimmicks, designed more for political posturing than what Congress really ought to be doing right now, and that is working together to create jobs on a long-term basis, to create long-term certainty for businesses throughout this country, Montana included, while we work to cut our deficit. The Democrats' proposal is the same included in the President's American Job Act, which I voted against several weeks ago. My reasons for voting against that proposal haven't changed. It would temporarily extend the Social Security payroll tax holiday through 2012 and paid for by raising taxes on the wealthy. And although I support making sure that millionaires and corporations pay their fair share in taxes, I do not believe this particular proposal will create jobs or give our economy the boost that it needs right now. A small one-year temporary tax cut will not give Main Street businesses the long-term certainty that they need to grow and hire. Now, the proposal by the Senate Republicans also temporarily extends the payroll tax holiday, but only by cutting certain Medicare benefits and cutting jobs and extending a current pay freeze for our folks that serve in public service. Neither of these proposals is right for Montana, and neither will earn my vote. I want to take you back a few weeks ago to November, where Congress unanimously passed my Veterans Jobs Bill called the Vow to Hire Heroes Act. The President already signed it into law, and I believe Congress has a responsibility to spend more time passing legislation like that, real solutions that create real jobs across this country, not political theater. And I know we can do it. It was appropriate for us to work for the veterans. It is also appropriate for us to work together to create jobs for all Americans. With that, I want to thank you, Mr. President, and suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka. Mr. Alexander. President, I ask unanimous consent to speak as if in morning business.
Was that the quorum call?
Ask unanimous consent to quorum call be dispensed with and be allowed to speak as if in morning business.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I want to rise in opposition to the second Feinstein Amendment, which is number 1126, I believe. I have the privilege of serving as Vice Chairman on the Intelligence Committee with Chairman Feinstein, and we have a very good working relationship, agree on most every issue that comes before the committee. And I know the diligence and seriousness with which she takes every issue, but particularly this issue, because we've had a number of discussions about the fact that we have a lack of a detainee and interrogation policy in this country now. And I know she's concerned about that, and I know she's trying to make the situation better. And I remain committed to work with her on a solution. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to oppose her amendment today because of my concerns about the limitation it imposes on the authority to detain Americans who have chosen to wage war against America. My first concern is that it appears from the debate yesterday that there is confusion among some members about what this amendment does. For example, my colleague and friend from Illinois, Senator Kirk, argued that he is in favor of robust and flexible U.S. military action overseas, including against American citizens like Anwar al-Awlaki. Senator Kirk said he supports the Feinstein Amendment, however, because he believes in a zone of protection for citizens inside the United States. But the Feinstein Amendment does not apply to only those American citizens who commit belligerent acts inside the United States. It would also prohibit the long-term military detention of American terrorists like Anwar al-Awlaki who commit terrorist acts outside the United States. As a result, this amendment would have the perverse effect of allowing American belligerents overseas to be targeted in lethal strikes but not held in U.S. military detention until the end of hostilities. That just makes no sense whatsoever. I'm also concerned about the ambiguity in the amendment's language and the uncertainty it will cause for our operators, especially our operators overseas. The amendment exempts American citizens from detention without trial until the end of hostilities. But short of the end of hostilities, the amendment appears to allow detention without trial. Is the Senator's intent to allow for some long-term detention of Americans without trial? This ambiguity is troubling because we don't know how the prohibition will be interpreted by our operators or by the courts that will hear inevitable habeas challenges. Would the military be permitted to hold a captured American belligerent for a month, a few months, or a few years, as long as it was not until the end of hostilities? Or would the military interpret the amendment as a blanket prohibition against military detention of Americans for any period of time? If the military rounded up American terrorists like Adam Gaddam or Adnan Shukri Juma among a group of terrorists, would they have to let these Americans go because the military would not be permitted to detain them? And would more American belligerents be killed in strikes if capture and detain operations were perceived to be unlawful? I just don't believe we can leave our operators with this kind of uncertainty. Finally, we should all remember that the provisions in the National Defense Authorization Act do not provide for a new authority to hold U.S. citizens in military detention. American citizens can be held in military detention under current law. And contrary to some claims that were made yesterday in debate on this floor, these Americans would be given ample due process to their ability to bring habeas corpus challenges to their detention in federal court. The Supreme Court has held in the Hamdi case that the detention of enemy combatants without the prospect of criminal charges or trial until the end of hostilities is proper under the AUMF and the Constitution. Hamdi is a U.S. citizen. This is not a new concept. In reaching its decision, the Hamdi court cited the World War II case Ex parte Quirin, in which the Supreme Court held, and I quote, Citizenship in the United States as an enemy belligerent does not relieve him from the consequences of a belligerency. In conclusion, I understand Senator Feinstein's motivation, but I just don't believe this amendment does what she wants it to do, and that there will be unintended consequences that could seriously hamper overseas capture operations. Mr. President, I urge my colleagues to oppose the Feinstein amendment. And I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Iowa.
Speak in morning, unanimous consent to speak in morning business.
Without objection.
For anybody interested, how long it might be, maybe roughly 10 minutes. Mr. President, for nearly a year, I've been investigating the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives on operation known as Fast and Furious. I have followed up on questions from that investigation as the Senate Judiciary Committee held oversight hearings over the past few weeks with both Secretary Janet Napolitano and Attorney General Eric Holder. Each of them testified about the aftermath of the shooting of Border Patrol agent Brian Terry. And I have sought to clarify what facts some of the half-truths that were said during these meetings. Each claimed that they were ignorant of the connection between Agent Terry's death and Operation Fast and Furious until my letters with whistleblower allegations brought the connection to light. However, documents that have come to light in my investigation draw those claims into question. I'd like to address a couple of those discrepancies. Secretary Napolitano went to Arizona a few days after Agent Terry's death. She said that she met at that time with the FBI agents and the assistant attorney, U.S. attorneys looking for the shooters. She also said that at that point in time, nobody knew about Fast and Furious. Yet documents show that many people knew about Fast and Furious on December 15th, the day that Agent Terry died. Secretary Napolitano referenced the FBI agents looking for the shooters. The head of the FBI Field Division was present at the December 15th press conference about Agent Terry's murder. At that very press conference, the FBI head told a chief assistant U.S. attorney about the connection to an ongoing ATF investigation. That same night, U.S. Attorney Dennis Burke confirmed that the guns tied back to Operation Fast and Furious. These connections were made days before Secretary Napolitano's visit to at that time. The very purpose of her visit was to find out more about the investigation. So a very important question comes up. The Department of Homeland Security oversees the Border Patrol. Why wouldn't the Phoenix FBI head have told Secretary Napolitano that the only guns found at the scene of Agent Terry's murder were tied to an ongoing ATF investigation? And let's not forget the U.S. Attorney's Office. Secretary Napolitano said that she met with the assistant U.S. attorneys looking for the shooters. The chief assistant U.S. attorney for the Tucson office, which coordinated the Terry investigation, found out about the ATF connection directly from our Federal Bureau of Investigation. So a very important question comes up that needs to be answered. Why would they conceal the Fast and Furious connection from Secretary Napolitano days later? The Tucson office is overseen by the U.S. Attorney for the District of Arizona, Dennis Burke, who confirmed to Tucson that guns came from Operation Fast and Furious. When Ms. Napolitano was governor of Arizona, Mr. Burke served as her chief of staff for 5 years. Secretary Napolitano acknowledges that she had conversations with him about the murder of Agent Terry. So a very important question comes up. Why would Mr. Burke conceal the Fast and Furious connection from Secretary Napolitano? Even before Secretary Napolitano came to Arizona, emails indicate Mr. Burke spoke on December the 15th with Attorney General Holder's Deputy Chief of Staff, Monty Wilkinson. So a very important question is unanswered. Before finding out about Agent Terry, Mr. Burke emailed Mr. Wilkinson that he wanted to, quote, unquote, explain in detail about Fast and Furious when they talked. On that phone call, this is a very important question. On that phone call, did U.S. Attorney Burke tell Mr. Wilkinson about the case connection to a Border Patrol agent's death that very day? The next day, Deputy Director at ATF made sure briefing papers were prepared about Operation Fast and Furious's connection to Agent Terry's death. He sent them to individuals here in Washington, D.C., in the Deputy Attorney General's office at the Justice Department. Within 24 hours, they were forwarded to the Deputy Attorney General. They were accompanied by personal emails from one of the Deputy Attorney General's assistants explaining the situation. 2 weeks later, that Deputy Attorney General, Gary Grindler, was named the Attorney General Holder's Chief of Staff. Yet, a month and a half after Agent Terry's death, Attorney General Holder was allegedly ignorant of Operation Fast and Furious's connection to the murder of Agent Terry. So a very important question is unanswered. Why wouldn't Mr. Grindler bring these serious problems with Attorney General Holder either as his Deputy Attorney General or as his Chief of Staff? It's clear that multiple high-placed officials in multiple agencies knew almost immediately of the connection between Operation Fast and Furious and Agent Terry's death. The Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security have failed to adequately explain why Attorney General Holder and Secretary Napolitano allegedly remained ignorant of that connection. Whether it's the Attorney General or the Secretary or members of their staff, somebody wasn't doing their job. Somebody wasn't serving their higher-ups as they should as proper staff people. In the case of Secretary Napolitano, either she was not entirely candid with me and others, or this was a gross breach on the part of those who kept her in the dark. The Border Patrol and the Department of Homeland Security lost a man, Agent Terry, being murdered. It was their right to know the full circumstances surrounding that from people who served under them. No one likes the unpleasant business of having to fess up, but the FBI, ATF, and U.S. Attorney's Office owed it to Agent Brian Terry and his family to fully inform the leadership of the Department of Homeland Security. This was the death of a federal agent involving weapons allowed to walk free by another agency in his own government. Let me explain walking guns. The federal government operates under rule of law, just like all of us have to live under that rule of law. There are licensed federal gun dealers. Federal gun dealers were encouraged to sell guns illegally to straw buyers and supposedly follow those guns across the border to somehow arrest people that were involved with drug trafficking and other illegal things. And two of these guns showed up at the murder scene of Agent Terry. So it's a very serious situation that we need to get to the bottom of. If that's not what I just described of all these unanswered questions, if that's not enough to brief up to the top of the department, then I don't know what is. In other words, staff people ought to be doing their job, or if staff people were doing their job, then the Congress and our constitutional job of oversight is being misled. I yield the floor.
President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Madam President, I request permission to speak as in morning business for 10 minutes.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I rise today to urge my colleagues to extend and expand the payroll tax cut and to fully extend unemployment compensation insurance immediately. The payroll tax cut and full extension of unemployment insurance are two of our best tools in strengthening our economic recovery. We must work without let-up to pass this legislation before year's end. Democrats are doing everything they can to create jobs and solve our unemployment crisis. Millions of Americans are still out of work, however, and looking for a job in the toughest economy since the Great Depression. And jobless benefits, which have been essential to millions of Americans as they search for a job, are set to expire at the end of this year. Congress has never failed to extend benefits when unemployment is this high. Unfortunately, right now, Republicans are refusing to fully extend unemployment insurance despite our nation's 9% unemployment rate. And in extending benefits, we should not do any less for the recently unemployed than we did for those who were unemployed in the last year or two. That is why I introduced the Emergency Unemployment Compensation Extension Act of 2011, which fully extends federal support for unemployment insurance through 2012. Extending benefits doesn't just make sense for a person who's been laid off, it makes sense for the economy as a whole. In fact, during today's hearing at the Senate Banking Committee, a business owner recognized that failing to extend unemployment insurance would have a negative impact on their business. Hard to quantify, but the sense they have from operating a very dispersed convenience store operation throughout this country is that they're likely to see negative impacts. And those impacts will be magnified and multiplied throughout our economy. It will ironically cause not just those without jobs to lose benefits, it will probably lead to further reductions in jobs as demand falls off and the need for employees, particularly in retail and establishments, might lessen. That's why if Congress truly wishes to help strengthen our economy, we need to extend unemployment insurance now. The reason we must fully extend unemployment insurance is simple. If people don't have jobs, they can't spend money. If people can't spend money, businesses go under. If businesses fail, more people lose their jobs, and the downward spiral continues. Extending unemployment insurance is not just the right thing to do, it's a wise investment with a strong rate of return that will provide a much-needed economic boost to every state across the country. This is a national phenomenon, regrettably, of unemployment. This program will address a nationwide problem, and it'll do it in an extraordinarily cost-effective way. Representatives of the CBO have calculated that this is probably the best return for the dollar that we can generate, because it's quite simple. People who are receiving unemployment benefits need that money to pay for groceries, to put some gas in the car, to take care of those immediate expenses. So as the economists would say, their marginal propensity to consume, i.e., their willingness to take the dollar in and spend it out, is very, very high. And as a result, this program not only helps families who are struggling, it immediately injects dollars and demand into the economy. They have a real benefit, these programs. We understand that what we have to do, what the great challenge is to grow the economy, and that means to create jobs. Again, this program will help stimulate demand, will help keep people at work and perhaps even, and we hope, put more people to work. When it comes to, as I said before, the efficacy of this program, the bang for the buck, it is among the most effective. I referred to some economists. In specific terms, Alan Blinder and Mark Zandi have estimated that for every dollar spent on extending unemployment benefits, the economy grows by $1.61. The Economic Policy Institute has estimated that failing to extend UI benefits for a year could result in the loss of $72 billion in economic activity for 2012. That translates to 560,000 jobs lost across the country if this activity, or not gained if this activity is not extended. So our country and our economy cannot afford this hit. We cannot afford to miss the opportunity to maintain or create almost 500,000 jobs. We cannot ignore the fact that in this very critical budget situation, this is one of the most cost-effective ways to continue to stimulate demand and grow jobs in our country. And we also have to understand that we are dealing with a situation that is getting to be critical because we're running out of time. These benefits will expire at the end of the year, and we must move forward. I think we can also do something else, and that is to improve this program. And one way to improve it is to adopt a program that is very effective in my state of Rhode Island and in several other states across the country. That's the Work-Share program. It's a voluntary program that prevents layoffs. It keeps people on the job. It helps employers retain skilled workers, and it strengthens the unemployment insurance system. Over 20 states are utilizing this program. They estimate they've saved 100,000 jobs in 2010 alone. Essentially, what it does, it allows an employer to keep people on the job for 3 out of 5 days of the week, and the other 2 days are compensated for by the Unemployment Insurance Fund. The fund saves money. The employer keeps these people in the workplace with all their skills, all their contribution to the firm. It is a win-win, and it's something that 20 states across this country have embraced, and I think it should be national, and we have provisions in our legislation that would help extend it nationally. Again, we cannot delay, and I urge all of my colleagues to join me and others in taking the needed steps for our economic recovery, for extending our unemployment compensation insurance program before the end of this year. And with that, Madam President, I would yield the floor.
Senator from North Dakota.
I rise to speak in regard to several amendments to the Defense Authorization Bill. First is in regard to the nuclear triad and the important role that it plays in defense of our nation and security in the world, and also in regard to the Global Hawk unmanned aerial systems program and the important role that it has for our forces both today in our efforts around the world and what it means to us in the future. First, in regard to Amendment 1279 and the nuclear triad, Madam President, this amendment is co-sponsored by Senators Tester, Senator Enzi, Senator Blunt, Senator Vitter, and also I would like to ask unanimous consent that my colleague from North Dakota, Senator Conrad, be included as a co-sponsor of the amendment, as well as Senator Baucus of Montana. The amendment declares that the United States should maintain a triad of strategic nuclear delivery systems, which include missiles, bombers, and submarines. It also declares that it is the sense of the Senate that the President should budget for the modernization of those systems and the weapons that they deliver. Over the past couple of years, numerous statements have been made in support of the triad. The 2010 Nuclear Posture Review concluded that the United States needs the nuclear triad. The Senate, in its resolution of ratification for the New START Treaty, declared that the United States needs the nuclear triad, and President Obama last February certified that he intends to modernize the nuclear triad. However, the administration is now currently conducting a further review of the role of that nuclear weapons play in defending U.S. national security, a miniature nuclear posture review, and it's important that the Senate reaffirm its commitment to the nuclear triad once again. I am particularly concerned by statements that we can reduce our nuclear arsenal significantly below the requirements laid out in the New START Treaty. Given the threats that we face and the responsibility that we have to the American people and to our allies, I believe we must retain the nuclear triad. The reasons are clear and compelling. We need missiles to provide a persistent, dispersed, and cost-effective deterrent. We need submarines to provide an invisible, mobile, and survivable deterrent. And we need bombers to provide a visible, long-range, recallable deterrent. The bottom line is that the triad provides us with a safe, credible, reliable nuclear deterrent that renders any effort to eliminate or sidestep our retaliatory capabilities completely meaningless. And those benefits accrue not only to the United States, but to our allies as well. The Congressional Strategic Posture Commission, the resolution of ratification to the New START Agreement, and the 2010 Nuclear Posture Review all concluded that the United States needs to maintain the triad. Now, the triad was developed out of a need to counter an immense threat from the Soviet Union. But it now gives us the flexibility to adapt to an ever-changing international security environment. And supporting a triad means supporting a program to maintain and enhance the weapons and delivery system that make up the triad. It is very important to point out, and particularly given our fiscal situation, that the cost of updating and maintaining the weapons in the triad will not take up a very big percentage of the defense budget, particularly relative to the tremendous security advantages it provides. In fact, General Keeler, the head of Strategic Command, recently indicated his strong support for efforts to preserve the triad and modernize each of the associated delivery systems. Now, it's tempting to assume that because the Cold War is over, we don't need the nuclear arsenal anymore. In fact, people who defend the nuclear arsenal are often accused of being stuck in a Cold War mindset. The truth is just the opposite. Only in a Cold War mindset would we assume Russia is the sole reason we preserve our nuclear arsenal. Today, our nuclear deterrent counters a variety of threats that did not even exist during the Cold War. and it hedges against the emergence of new nuclear threats. The decades following the end of the Cold War have made nuclear deterrence far more complicated than the old superpower confrontation of the last century. We must now counter nuclear threats from multiple actors around the world. First, consider China. China's military modernization program is built on a foundation of a large and growing nuclear arsenal. Intelligence estimates suggest that the number of warheads atop Chinese ICBMs capable of reaching the United States could more than double within the next 15 years. Recent reports indicate China is fielding 4 different new nuclear-ready ballistic missiles. China is prioritizing the development of mobile land-based ICBMs and submarine-launched ballistic missiles. China's nuclear posture is also troubling. China has not defined what it would consider a minimum nuclear deterrent, making it difficult to understand the motivations behind China's nuclear force expansion and their modernization efforts. Second, new nuclear powers like North Korea and Pakistan further complicate how we calculate our need for deterrence. North Korea has pursued nuclear weapons using both plutonium and uranium and continues to develop long-range ballistic missiles that can threaten the United States. North Korea's nuclear arsenal forces our allies in East Asia, especially South Korea and Japan, to put a premium on the U.S. nuclear deterrent. Pakistan's nuclear weapons greatly complicate the security situation in Central Asia and create a serious risk of nuclear proliferation. And the emergence of these 2 nuclear powers is a cautionary tale about the unpredictable ripple effects of new players in the nuclear game and a strong reason why reductions to U.S. strategic forces should only be made with the greatest caution. Third, nuclear proliferation will remain one of our foremost security challenges in the world. The IAEA reports that Iran has been researching and developing nuclear weapons, and it expressed serious concerns about the military dimensions of Iran's nuclear program. Syria was so serious about developing a nuclear weapon, probably with the help of North Korea and Iran, that in 2007 Israel had to destroy a Syrian nuclear site. Terrorist groups and other rogue actors also seek the development or the acquisition of nuclear arms. And of course, fourth, we cannot yet forget about Russia. Under the provisions of the New START agreement, Russia can expand its nuclear force rather than pursue reductions. Russia intends to build a new heavy ICBM to be available by 2018. Russia expects to build 8 new nuclear submarines, and it also plans on designing and building a new nuclear bomber. We cannot afford to let our nuclear deterrent atrophy in light of so many nuclear threats. Once we lose nuclear capabilities, it will be extremely hard to reconstitute them. We need a reliable and credible nuclear arsenal. We need it to dissuade new nations from acquiring nuclear weapons. We need it to deter nuclear powers from using their weapons, and we need it to hold enemy arsenals at risk. People may not always stop and think about the demands placed on America's nuclear deterrent, but they are real and they are extensive. We have nuclear weapons as a guarantor of the security of the American homeland. Our nuclear arsenal renders any plan to strike the United States with nuclear weapons sheer folly. The investments made over the last several decades continue to pay dividends by creating the space within which America can address other security threats. Make no mistake, without a large nuclear arsenal, other nations would move plans to strike the United States from the category of unthinkable to possibly thinkable. Second, and nearly as important, the United States nuclear deterrent replaces the need for our allies to develop or acquire nuclear weapons, keeping the peace in critical regions around the world. East Asia is a particularly good example. The status of U.S. nuclear posture is a major concern in Japan. Despite assurances from the United States that our nuclear umbrella will continue to protect Japan, Tokyo is worried that even the most subtle changes in U.S. policy. During his most recent trip, Secretary Panetta publicly reiterated the U.S. commitment to protect South Korea and our nuclear umbrella. And our nuclear deterrent is likely the only reason why South Korea has not developed a nuclear capability in response to North Korea's nuclear program. I'll conclude on the triad. Our nuclear deterrent has been the foundation of U.S. national security since World War II. The nuclear triad provides an incredible return on our investment, and I urge the Senate to send a strong signal of support for the nuclear triad as laid out in Amendment 1279. And, Madam President, if I may very briefly also address the importance of the Global Hawk with a brief overview of Amendment 1358. This amendment simply states that it is the sense of Congress that the Secretary of the Air Force should continue to abide by the guidelines set forth in the Acquisition Decision Memorandum issued June 14, 2011 from the Office of the Secretary of Defense. That memorandum on Global Hawk, the RQ-4 Global Hawk, found that the Global Hawk UAS is essential to national security and that there is no other program that can provide the benefits to the warfighter that the Global Hawk can provide. The Global Hawk is a vital intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance asset. The Global Hawk flies at high altitude. It can fly at extended ranges and for long periods of time, and it can carry a wide array of sensors simultaneously. We have invested a lot of time and a lot of money in this platform, and it is paying fast dividends. The Global Hawk is flown in a wide variety of missions all over the world in support for things like CENTCOM operations, humanitarian relief efforts in Japan and Haiti, and extensively for operations in Libya. For these reasons and many more, my amendment stresses that the Air Force must continue to heed the conclusions of the June 14, 2011 Acquisition Decision Memorandum on the RQ-4 program. The RQ-4 program, which is Global Hawk, remains essential to the United States national security and is irreplaceable. The bottom line is America needs to support and continue the Global Hawk. Our commanders require as much information about the battlefield as they can get. The RQ-4 represents a new generation of ISR aircraft with unprecedented capabilities. And finally, we must invest in this essential capacity precisely because budgets are tight. And as the Pentagon concluded in June, the Global Hawk represents the most cost-effective way to meet the requirements of our warfighters now and in the future. Thank you, Madam President, and I yield the floor.
President?
Senator from Alabama.
Madam President, I would like to address my amendment number 1274, which would clarify, I believe, existing law, that the President has authority to continue to detain an enemy combatant under the laws of war following a trial before a military commission or an Article III court, and regardless of the outcome of that trial. Let me explain what I mean. As I said yesterday, although under the law of war, the President has the authority to detain an enemy combatant, a prisoner of war, a captured enemy soldier, belligerent. He can detain them through the duration of the hostilities. The President is not required, the Commander-in-Chief is not required to release an individual whose sworn duty it is to return to his military outfit and commence hostilities again against the United States. That individual could be killed on the battlefield, but if they're captured, you're not required under all laws of war that I'm aware of, and certainly the Geneva Conventions, you can maintain that individual in custody to prevent them from attacking you. But you can also try an individual who's been captured if that individual violated the rules of war. For example, a decent soldier from Germany, many of them were held in my state of Alabama. They behaved well. They drew paintings of American citizens. They did a lot of things and did not cause a lot of trouble. And they were in uniform and they complied with the rules of war, and they were not tried as illegal enemy combatants. But many of the terrorists today don't wear uniforms, deliberately target innocent men, women, and children, deliberately violate multiple rules of war. Those individuals are subject, in addition to being held as a combatant, as an unlawful combatant, they can be prosecuted. And they should be prosecuted. In World War II, a group of Nazi saboteurs in the ex parte Quirin case were let out of a submarine off, I think, Long Island. They came into the country with plans to sabotage the United States. They were captured and tried by military commission. Several were American citizens, and a number of them, most of them, frankly, after being tried and convicted, were executed. The Supreme Court of the United States approved that procedure. But recent cases demonstrate the potential problem we have today. One Guantanamo Bay detainee has already raised the question that I have discussed before the military commission where he's being tried. Abed al-Rahman al-Nashiri, the alleged mastermind of the United States Cole bombing, was arraigned before a military commission on November 9th. He was held not only as an al-Qaeda or a belligerent against the United States, but he was charged with an violation of the rules of war. This was a group that sneaked into the harbor pretending to be innocent people and ran their boat in against the Cole and killing a number of United States sailors. I remember being at a christening on one of the Navy ships at Norfolk not long after this, and I walked out of that area and I heard one of the sailors cry out, "Remember the Cole." And the hair still stands up on my neck when I hear it. We have an obligation to defend our men and women in uniform. They're out on the high seas. They're in a neutral port. They're expected to be treated according to the laws of war, and then they're murdered by an individual like this. But this individual's lawyers filed a motion asking the military judge to clarify the effect of an acquittal should the commission acquit him. He argued that the members of the commission had a right to know what would happen if he were acquitted, because they might object to taking part in what he called a show trial if it turned out that he would continue to be detained at Guantanamo Bay. Now, there's another case in which the administration was almost confronted with the problem a year ago in the case of a former Guantanamo detainee, an al-Qaeda member named Ahmed Galani, who was responsible for the 1998 embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania. Most of us remember those early al-Qaeda bombings against our embassies in Africa. After the Justice Department chose to prosecute Galani in an Article III civilian court and directed the United States Attorney not to seek the death penalty, which I'm not sure why that ever happened. We don't know. But the jury acquitted him on 284 out of 285 counts. Luckily, he received a life sentence on the single count of conspiracy for which he was convicted. But what if he hadn't been convicted? What if there was insufficient evidence to prove he committed a crime, but not insufficient evidence to prove he was an unlawful, a combatant against the United States? Al-Qaeda has declared war against the United States officially and openly. The United States Congress has authorized the use of military force against Al-Qaeda, which is the equivalent of a declaration of war. Well, what if he had received a modest sentence after being convicted or and had credit for time served? What if he had been acquitted on all 285 counts? Would the President have been required to release him into the United States if the government couldn't get some country to take him? That would be wrong. He was at war against the United States. He was a combatant against the United States. Like any other captured combatant, he can be held as long as the hostilities continue. And by the way, let me note that military commissions are open. If they decide to try one of these individuals, not just hold them as a prisoner of war, but hold them and try them for violation of the laws of war. They get lawyers, they get procedural rights. The Supreme Court has established what those rights are. Congress has passed laws effectuating what the Supreme Court said these trials should consist of, and a mechanism has been set up to fairly try them. But enemy combatants are not common criminals. If a bank robber is denied bail, he remains in jail awaiting a trial. Speedy public trial with government-paid lawyers. Enemy combatants are not sitting in Guantanamo Bay waiting trial by a military commission or by an Article III court. They are held in military custody precisely because they are enemies, combatants against the United States. They should continue to be held there as long as the war continues. And as long as they do not remain a threat to return to the battlefield against the United States. So this is an important point, considering that 27% of the former Guantanamo detainees that have been released, 161 out of 600, have returned to the battlefield, attacked Americans. This nation has no obligation to release captured enemy prisoners of war when we know for an absolute fact that 27% of them have returned to war against the United States. And how many others have, but we just don't have proof of it. And that's what the whole history of warfare is. Lincoln ceased exchanging prisoners with the South after he realized that they had more soldiers in the South. And it was not to his advantage to release captured Southern soldiers who would return to the fight. So he held them until the war was over. Under the laws of war, the President has the authority to prevent an enemy combatant from returning to the battlefield. And that's consistent with all history. This amendment, please, Senators, I hope you would note, would make it clear that the President simply has authority to continue to detain enemy combatants held pursuant to the rules of war, even though they may have been tried, regardless of where that trial would be held and what the outcome was, as long as, of course, they could prove they were enemy combatant and violating rules of war. So, Mr. President, I would note one thing. I see my senator friend from California is here and probably is ready to speak. On the question of citizenship, can a citizen be held in this fashion? The Supreme Court has clearly held that they may, but the senator is offering legislation that might change that. My amendment doesn't answer that question. It just simply says a combatant should be able to be held under the standard of a prisoner of war, a combatant, even if they had been prosecuted for violation of the laws of war and acquitted. It's common sense. I believe the courts will hold that, but it's an issue that's out there. I think Congress would do well to settle it today. I urge my colleagues to do so. I thank the chairman and yield the floor. Madam President, I note the absence of a quorum.